Good morning, all. Lovely to see you on this fine day. Just going to wait a moment just whilst we let cyberspace do its thing. It always takes a little bit of time to let people in. Hope everyone's got their coffee. Quite a big report we've got to go this morning. So really looking forward to getting stuck in. As I prattle a little bit longer, just whilst we wait for people to come in through that cyberspace. Right, let's kick things off. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Women's Sport Trust webinar. I am Tammy Parler, Chief Executive of the Women's Sport Trust, and I'll be your host this morning. There's been much to celebrate over the past few years. We've got attendance and viewing records that have been consistently smashed. Women's sport engagement levels are increasing, and the industry, it feels like, has woken up to the opportunity of women's sport. But 2023 has also shown us the enormity of what still needs to be done to get this right. From controversy and late signing of the FIFA Women's World Cup broadcasting rights to the England Rugby Reds Roses autumn matches failing to find a TV broadcaster, and DAZN reversing their paywall decision for women's football, 2023 has been a year when the visibility of women's sport itself caught the headlines in significant ways. When Women's Sport Trust first started monitoring visibility, it was to provide much needed data to prove that not only does an audience for women's sport exist, but it is growing at an incredible rate. And we're moving, it feels, to this new era of women's sport, when data and insight needs to get much more sophisticated. I think this report gives a level of detail around attendances, digital and broadcast that has never been compiled in one place. Feels like it's an important temperature check on the current state of women's sport, and I really hope that it's going to stimulate your thinking. I'll be presenting some of the findings this morning. We'll be joined by Shalina, Charlie and Lizzie from Futures Sport and Entertainment, who provide us with broadcast data and insight. We also have 4 industry experts joining us towards the end of the webinar as we explore the levers we have to drive enhanced visibility. There is an awful lot to get through. I hope there'll be a chance for questions, so please list those in the chat. Trustee Laura Weston will be monitoring that, and we really want to know what you think. It's all downloadable from our website, and you'll get the link through your event by registration. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Charlie.
So a reminder for those of you who haven't seen, this is kind of how we're going to categorize women's, mixed and men's sports by property throughout the report. So women's sport and men's sport is where we can kind of clearly define based on the data, but mixed sport includes both. So properties like tennis, grand slams fall here. So I guess a key figure, which you guys may have already seen before, is that the most number of people ever watched women's sports in the UK in 2023, which was 46.7 million. So this is significantly 1 million more people than those who watched in 2019, which was when kind of the last Women's Football World Cup took place. And as you'll see throughout the report, international women's football tournaments are kind of a key driver of viewership, and that's why we see a dip in 2020 and 2021. So when looking at the most watched women's sports moments throughout the year, the top 5 events all came from the Women's World Cup, with obviously the final being the top event of the year with 38.4 million viewing hours. When looking at the top non-Women's World Cup moment, that came from an England versus Scotland game in the UEFA Women's Nation League. And then looking at the top non-football moment, that was again England versus Scotland, but this time from the Women's Six Nations. On the right-hand side, we can see how this top moment compares across the last 5 years, and slightly less, obviously, than the Euros last year, the top moment from 2022. But good to see that it's obviously higher than the last Women's World Cup, which took place in France in 2019. So that previous slide was for free-to-air only. This is kind of a similar slide, but just for pay TV. I guess the thing that stands out to me here is that the top 5 most watched women's sports moments events in 2023 were all higher than the top events from 2019 to 2022. with the Solheim Cup Day 3 singles being the most watched women's sports event on pay TV throughout the year at 3.1 million viewing hours. It's also good to see that a range of sports such as cricket and golf are included in this slide, and not just football that we saw on free to air.
So this slide shows the coverage hours and viewing hours by broadcaster for women's sport in 2023. So free to air BBC and ITV account for 11% of coverage, but 77% of viewing hours. Sky makes up a large proportion of the coverage with 72%, and this is converted to 22% of viewing hours. So overall, we can see that free to air remains the main driver for women's sport in 2023. So here we're delving a bit deeper into the coverage and viewing hour relationship and the changes we've seen compared to 2022. Looking at some of the channels in more detail, we saw on BBC increased coverage hours, but a decrease in viewing hours compared to 2022. But this was driven heavily by the Euros and the Women's World Cup. For ITV, we saw a slight drop in coverage, but a large increase in viewing hours, driven by the Women's World Cup. And then for Sky Sports, we saw an increase across both metrics. So a really positive story for commercial growth of women's sport. This slide looks at the parity of women's sport as a proportion of all sport across key linear TV channels. For example, on BBC One, 13% of all sports coverage was for women's sport, which was converted to 12% of all sports viewing hours. In terms of coverage, 8% was for women's sport in 2023, compared to 13% in the previous year. And then for viewing hours, 10% was for women's sport in 2023, compared to 15% in the previous year. This slide looks at the parity of TV news mentions for women's sport on the left and mixed sport on the right, as a proportion of all sport. So top line, the story is very similar year on year, and we've seen minimal growth of TV news mentions for women's sport. 8% of all sport mentions were for women's sport, the same as in 2022, whereas mixed sport saw 15% of all mentions compared to 18% in the previous year. There is some variation by channel, and we saw the biggest increase for women's sport on Sky Sports News. This slide looks at the proportion of press text mentions by news outlet for men's, women's, and mixed sport for 2023. We've seen that women's sport coverage varies by print publication, but there's been little overall change from the previous year. So in 2023, 3% of mentions were for women's sport compared to 4% in 2022, and 21% were for mixed sport, the same as the previous year.
It tracks various online publications for prominence as well, looking at the top 10 stories on their sport website. BBC Sport continues to lead the way in this area, Guardian and Sky Sports both registering another increase. But despite leading the print table, as shown in the previous slide, Telegraph Sports saw the prominence they gave to women's sport actually decline. Really interesting to breaking down some of those results. Now, here we look at the BBC Sport website from April to September. It's really interesting to see the prominence of women's football. But this wasn't just down to the impact of the Women's World Cup. When you focus in on just April and May, only men's football achieved more coverage than women's football. I guess it also reminds us the dominance of that men's football voice. It's a challenge for all sports, not just women's sport. Let's look at digital engagement. Now, aside from broadcast viewership, there was a lot happening on digital. Some fantastic stats here from BBC iPlayer and ITVX. Figures from Sky Sports also showed the demographics of their YouTube channel shifting to be more female when women's sports content was shown. Digital is giving us new ways to connect with fans. A couple of examples. We have fan groups emerging on Facebook, Arsenal boasting over 200,000 members. Women's specific channels are growing. Here we highlight Man United's TikTok account, which has almost 1 million fans. And clubs like Chelsea have been using WhatsApp to communicate with supporters and cross-promote the women's game. We expect to see a lot more of this sort of stuff developing. At a league level, we're seeing an explosion in video consumption. WSL seeing a 268% increase in TikTok views, and Facebook views increasing to 286 million, for example. Likewise, the Women's Six Nations, and you'll recall that TikTok was the title sponsor last year, saw a 586% year-on-year increase in video views. Now, as far as what content is getting those sorts of numbers, here's the most viewed TikTok videos on the WSL account. And they mirror the themes we outlined in our research with the RNA last summer of what women's sport fans want. Videos celebrating world-class match action, skills, highlights, and funnies, all performing extremely well. And for the Women's Six Nations TikTok account, promo videos received huge numbers, possibly as a result of a marketing spend. Now, this slide I find really quite exciting. We compared global domestic women's leagues from top to bottom. It shows we've got, just to let you know with the logos, we've got Barclays WSL here in the UK at the top, the Australia's rugby league competition, US women's football, US women's basketball league, and then the Indian women's cricket league at the bottom. Look at how well the WS is performing on Facebook and TikTok. It shows where the potential growth is too if the league wants to dominate on all channels. So WNBA is dominating at league level on Instagram, but when you start to look at things at a club level, there's a whole different story that starts to get told. European football teams achieve significantly more in Instagram video interactions. Compare that to those in American clubs, and you get a sense perhaps of the global power of that European football brands, even in the women's game.
The next section, we're going to focus on linear TV. So Tammy's just taken us through digital. Now we're going to see what happened on TV. So to start, we took a look at the average viewing time per person for the last 5 years. In 2019, which has kind of been the peak of women's sport for a long time, had just under 6 hours viewing time per person. You can see that it's been on an upward trend since then. And it's exciting to see that in 2023, we had just over 10 hours. So almost double what we were seeing only 5 years ago. And then importantly, also an over an hour increase versus 2022 as well. So then looking at women's sport on a 3-minute reach, so slightly different to the threshold that Charlie shared earlier, 2023 is slightly down on what we saw for 2019 and 2022. Both of those global football tournaments took place in sort of European time zones, so they're friendly for UK viewers, and that kind of caused the reach to go up slightly. But we'll delve into a little bit further why 2023 is slightly down. Just taking that one step further and looking at women's sport reach across a few different thresholds, so from 1 minute through to 2 hours plus. I guess firstly, you can see that back in 2012, the numbers were significantly lower. So in this sort of 10-11 year period, women's sport has really grown significantly, over doubling what we were seeing just 10 years ago. For 2023, the key change in terms of where it goes down slightly versus the previous year is kind of in that 3 15-minute threshold. So we wanted to have a look at why that has gone down. When you look at more in sort of the avid viewership, so kind of 1 hour, 2+ hours of women's sport viewership, it's actually relatively stable year on year. So digging into the last couple of years, we took a look at kind of the properties that were driving that reach, and obviously excluding the global tournaments, which we kind of touched upon already. The next biggest property in terms of the domestic side of things was games featuring the Lionesses, so things like the international friendlies, UEFA Women's Nations League, things like that. So not the Euros or the Women's World Cup. Those Lionesses games, there were 14 in 2022. With 6 games taking place after the successful Women's Euros. And then in 2023, there were 10 games featuring the Lionesses, so 4 fewer. And 3 of those games took place after the Women's World Cup. That resulted in 10 million fewer viewing hours, so a clear difference there. But I guess looking at it in terms of engagement, we wanted to see how many times people viewed these games. So on the left-hand side there, we've got a number of times viewed, so 1, 2, and 3+. For 2022, over half, 57%, watched just 1 time, and then 24% watched 3 or more times. When we contrast that to 2023, we're still bringing in people, so 67% watched at least 1 game. But then you can see that the kind of more avid viewership of people that are watching 3 or more times, that dropped to 16%. I guess one thing to note here, though, is that this is obviously linear TV, and as Tammy's just mentioned, people are really engaging with content in different ways now, especially on digital and social media. So it could be that some of these numbers are actually increased when we kind of add in the full picture of digital as well. So taking kind of the avid viewership, so looking at people that watch for 2 hours or more, there were 21.5 million viewers for women's sport in 2023. Obviously, quite a lot of women's sport just still air on free to air. So we wanted to compare that to a few other properties, kind of, I guess, benchmark where women's sport really does stand. So we took a few sports properties that kind of have majority free to air coverage in terms of either live or non-live. And as you can see, the women's sport number there is higher than what we saw for the Rugby World Cup and Wimbledon, which obviously air exclusively on free to air. And then looking at the right-hand side at entertainment programming, so picking some of the most popular shows that air across different free-to-air channels. Again, you can see that women's sport outperformed that. So Strictly Come Dancing, their highest at 17.1 million, which obviously on BBC One in that Sunday primetime slot, but women's sport still outperforming that, as well as other popular ones like I'm a Celeb and Bake Off. So sticking with engagement, we wanted to look at kind of the growth from 2019 onwards. So on the left-hand side, we've got the average percent of total program viewed, so how long people were watching the entire program. So for 2023, we're at 39% of people watching the entire show. As you can see, obviously that's higher than what we'd seen in previous years. 2019 was actually the previous highest there at 37.5%. It actually dropped off a little bit in 2022. So kind of the opposite year in terms of a little bit higher overall reach, but slightly less engagement. So it's really positive to see that 2023 is kind of back on that upward trend of people watching for longer. And then on the right-hand side, looking at the number of times viewed, and we wanted to split this by pay TV so we can kind of get a better idea of where's the sort of commercial aspect of women's sport going and is that growing? And it's a really positive story in that not only are the number of times people watching increasing, but it's kind of across all. So for 2023, we've got 40% that are watching at least once. So we're still bringing in people to women's sport on pay TV, and that's higher than what we saw in 2022. But then when you cast your eyes to the end of this chart, where you've got the 10 plus, you can see that 2023 had the highest, so 18%, just higher than what we saw for 2022. So it's a great story in that like pay TV is still bringing in people, new viewers to watch, but then they've also got kind of a group of people that are a bit more avid and actually watching on multiple occasions. So a positive story there in terms of the commercial nature of women's sport. And then in the bottom, we just wanted to do a quick nod to the global international tournaments, just because they are such a big part of women's sport viewership in the UK. And again, it's a positive story in that for 2023, still bringing in new people, so the highest percentage of people watching on one occasion, and then again, the same story in that highest percentage of people watching on 10 plus occasions. And then again, just comparing women's sport across a few different properties as well to see kind of where it really stands. So looking at number of times women's sport viewed, as I mentioned, that 10 plus number gone up slightly, and then the average viewing time again gone up to just above 10 hours. When we compare that to any sport viewership on TV, the number of times watched was slightly down, and then the average viewing time had gone up a little bit. Sport has generally been a bit more resilient to kind of the linear TV decline that we've been seeing over the last few years. But it's important to note that obviously that increase of 38% is significantly lower than what we saw for women's sport in this period, which was 71%. And then just comparing to entertainment programs as well. So number of times viewed has gone down again as well. And average viewing time has actually gone down for entertainment programs as well. Again, one thing to note is that obviously some of these programs have kind of moved towards streaming platforms as well, and different types of content. So there is also that digital aspect to it as well, kind of building out the wider picture for linear TV. But nonetheless, a really positive story for women's sport there. I guess in terms of a little bit of reality check, obviously you can see that those numbers in terms of the amount of times viewed is a little bit lower for women's sports, so kind of in the 23% for that avid versus 73% for sport and 88% for entertainment. So while still growing, it's obviously still a little bit of a gap before we reach the levels of some of those other properties. And then again, kind of sticking with comparing across a few different other properties, we wanted to just take a quick look at demographics and kind of who are the people watching women's sport. So in terms of how it compares, it's kind of fairly similar, which I guess you might expect to Total TV because obviously women's sport does air quite a lot on free to air. But we've got a roughly even gender split for Total TV, kind of mirrored by women's sport. I guess the key difference here is the dark green bar of people aged 55 plus. So for Total TV, that definitely skews on the older end of 62% being over the age of 55 and only 21% having children in their household. Whereas when you compare that to sport, it's a bit younger, a bit more of a family audience. So 39% for men's sport, 45% for women's sport. And then again, that children and household number being significantly higher for sport viewers compared to total TV. So then we wanted to take a look and see if women's sport is still attracting new viewers. So to start, we're just going to take a step back and look at previous years. So this slide here is a viewer overlap. So the green circle on the left is the reach for women's sport on pay TV channels only for 2021 and 2022. So just under 13 million. And then the big grey circle is the 3-minute reach for women's sport on free-to-air channels. So that 38.7 million. And then we wanted to see how those interact. So people only watching on free-to-air or people watching on both types of channels. So you can see that 11.3 million people watched on both channel types, but there's a vast majority of people, so 71% of the total free-to-air viewership that only watch on free-to-air. That obviously might be that they don't have access to pay TV, or they were kind of new to women's sport and only watched on free-to-air, and that was their access point. But it's interesting to see that that's quite a high number. So that free-to-air reach really bringing in new people. This slide here is the exact same premise, but just kind of shifted a year. So the pay TV reach, that green circle for 2022 and 2023, it's really positive to see it's actually gone up a lot. So that's 15.9 million for those 2 years. So I guess we've kind of touched upon it already, but a clear growth in pay TV viewership for women's sport. And then again, the group of people that are watching both has also increased. So that was 11.3 million on the previous slide. So an additional 1 million viewers there watching across both. So again, really positive story for the commercial side and the viability of women's sport. In terms of the new viewers, it's a little bit lower actually in terms of the free-to-air only viewers. So 65% of the total, or 23 million. I guess on the surface, a lower number might seem a negative, but it's actually a fairly good story in that I guess we want people to be brought in from free-to-air, but then sort of move to pay TV or kind of interact with women's sport on different platforms as well. So hopefully those viewers are kind of coming in, but then staying and moving on to different aspects of women's sport. Obviously, I guess the large part of where we get those new viewers from is those global tournaments. So we wanted to take a quick look at how the Women's World Cup fared in that sense. So there were 15.6 million people that watched the Women's World Cup this past summer that hadn't watched any women's sport prior in 2023. So they'd seen the content, the Women's World Cup on TV, and then decided to watch it, but hadn't seen women's sport before. And then 43% of those new viewers went on to watch women's sport after. So a really high conversion in terms of people brought in from the World Cup and then coming on to watch more women's sport afterwards. Just contrasting that to the Euros in 2022, the number of new viewers was a little bit lower, so 13.5 million, but the conversion afterwards was a little higher, so 53%. I think one of the key points of this story is that when you look at the reach prior to those two tournaments starting, it was 4 million higher in 2023. So kind of a clear view that 2023 kind of capitalized on what happened in the previous year. And there was kind of more people interested in women's sport at the beginning of the year before these global tournaments took place. Just going a bit further on those new viewers from the Women's World Cup who then went on to watch women's sport afterwards. The demographics are kind of fairly similar to what we've seen for overall women's sport. There's 30% children in household and the average age is 52. And then that gender split slightly less balanced at 46% female. And then in terms of what they're watching after the Women's World Cup, I guess football is still most popular there. So the Women's Super League and the UEFA Women's Nations League kind of topped the properties that they watched. But after that, it's positive to see that it's actually some variation. So the Solheim Cup and then the 100 as well, making it into the top 6 events that they watched after the Women's World Cup. And then just switching slightly, because we obviously new viewers are important, but we also want to make sure that we're capturing returning viewers. So this slide here is just taking a look at people that watched in 2022 only on free-to-air. So they hadn't watched any women's sport content on pay TV in 2022. And the vast majority of those viewers then came back to watch women's sport in 2023. So it's positive to see that they were brought in from free-to-air and then now they're kind of returning and watching either on free-to-air or pay TV, but nonetheless still returning to women's sport. In terms of what they watched, channel-wise, I guess it's as you'd expect from free-to-air, BBC One and ITV1 really making up the majority of the viewership there, and then a bit of a drop-off to BBC Two. In terms of properties, again, Women's World Cup is obviously highest at 51% of the total viewership. But in terms of free-to-air coverage, obviously there's a lot of football that airs, And so that makes up the vast majority of the top properties, with the Women's Six Nations the only non-football one to make it into the top there. In terms of pay TV, again, it's a bit more of a varied story, kind of similar to what Charlie shared earlier, in that the top properties are actually really balanced across a few different properties. So Women's Super League still being highest there, but when you look at the total, it's not such a big drop off to the next properties after, the way it was for free to air. So you can see that there's cricket, golf, and rugby league as well, making it into the top. And then just taking that a bit further, we wanted to see whether there was a kind of a group of people that were just interested in the women's edition of sports. I guess we've spoken a lot about kind of capturing men's sport fans as well, but we want to make sure that we're looking at the group of people that might only be interested in the women's side. So these next few slides are kind of, again, a viewer overlap, taking the men's edition and the women's edition and kind of seeing where that overlap happens. So starting with just kind of an overall number, of the 37.8 million people that watched women's sport in 2023, the vast majority did watch men's sport as well. So only 7% didn't. But when we look at it by sport, there's kind of a lot of variation. So in terms of live coverage only, looking at the Premier League and the Barclays WSL on the very left, and then the Men's World Cup from 2022, and then the Women's World Cup from this past summer, there's quite a high percentage of people that are only watching the women's edition. So you can see there, kind of the percentages are the percent of the total women's edition reach that didn't watch any of the men's version. Interestingly, when you add in non-live content, so things like the Women's Football Show, Match of the Day, and some of those magazine programs, the number really shifts. So there's quite a big percentage of people that I guess are coming in and watching those non-live contents, which makes sense as obviously those are on free to air, whereas especially like the Premier League, for example, is obviously only on pay TV, so some people might not have access to that. Taking the middle one a bit further, so looking at the Men's World Cup versus the Women's World Cup, we wanted to see how those demographics change. So the people that are kind of only watching the Women's World Cup and not the men's, how do they compare to just the average viewer for the Men's World Cup? And it's interesting in that it's kind of fairly similar demographic. So it's kind of a clear trend in terms of the demographics of people watching sport. But I guess the key difference that we wanted to call out here is that those that were watching the Men's World Cup were a little bit more likely to have children in their household. So 38% of all viewers for the Men's World Cup versus 34% for the Women's World Cup only group. And then finally on this section, we just wanted to have a look at different sports as well. So obviously these sports are all kind of in different parts of their development and obviously air on different channels, etc. So the numbers do vary quite a bit, which is interesting. So the 106 nations are actually somewhat similar, sort of just over 1 million viewers that are unique to the women's property. About 22 to 26% of that total reach. But what's interesting here is the bottom one for the golf. There's a really clear group of people that are kind of only interested in the women's open and not the men's. So 60% of the overall reach. However, worth noting that obviously that the absolute number there is about half of what we were seeing for the 106 nations, which obviously do have some free-to-air coverage. And you can really see the difference in that in the men's side of things in terms of the absolute numbers. So 17.7 million people only watching the men's Six Nations versus 6.3 for the 100, just based on that total free-to-air coverage versus partial for the 100.
There's so much information in this deck, and there's some slides that for me just pop and really kind of open your head up, and this is one of them. It really reminds us that we need to think about the metrics we use when we're analysing things. Now, taking the DAZN Women's Football channel, this is November, the start of the Women's Champions League group stages. If you look at 30-second views, male audiences dominate. If you change that to minutes watched per viewer, there's a totally different story. DAZN just need to do more to attract these audiences in large numbers. Digging into the NWSL, so the American Football League on YouTube, is also a reminder as to what's possible. They don't have the history of men's teams like the WSL or the WNBA, yet are attracting a highly engaged female audience in large numbers. All female groups watched more minutes per video than any male demographic in November, the month in which the championship final was played. So it's possible to draw in a new audience without relying on the men's audience. We asked Two Circles to repeat a slide they did for us last year, and it shows more good stories for women's sport. Almost 750,000 fans went through the turnstiles for WSL games, and figures on this slide don't even include the fans who attended the 100 on joint men's and women's tickets. Talking of record-breaking, Women's FA Cup final 1.6 times the crowd in 2022. The Ashes, 4.5 times. I think somebody's just taken themselves off mute, so if I could just get you to put those on mute, that would be great. Or someone who has controls be able to find the person and mute them for us. Brilliant, thank you very much. Because obviously I'm talking about fascinating things. So Red Roses, world record crowd against France for the Women's Six Nations, doubling average attendances. And Arsenal broke the record for WSL crowd with 314% increase in ticket sales. And when you delve into the demographics of attendees, it's clear a new and unique audience is being brought into watching women's sport. All of these three are examples of how TV audiences and ticket purchasers tend to be different. Now, this looks specifically at the female proportion of ticket holders' viewers, and again shows that difference in demographics being brought in through these different ways. And there's not a one-size-fits-all model for how you both market to women's sport fans and then the services they require when they get to matches. Examples from Chelsea and England Netball show that it's appealing to lots of different sectors that will require different approaches. And then you can do some funky things like considering distance travelled of a women's sport fan. When you compare England international cricket ticket purchasers, women's cricket fans are far more likely to be local. Now, we don't know if that will continue. If you look at Man City women's ticket data, the average distance travelled to games has already increased. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves.
Now, moving back to linear TV, we've seen so far that major international football events have had a large impact on broadcast audiences. So we wanted to think about the impact of having no major international football event for England in 2024 by looking back at how football has impacted 2023. So here we can see the 3-minute unique reach for all women's sport programming, excluding major global events. So Football World Cup, Football Euros, Cricket World Cup, Netball World Cup, and Rugby League and Union World Cups. So in 2023, women's sport achieved 29.2 million in unique reach, just below that of 2022, but higher than the 3 years prior. We wanted to look a bit deeper into how the unique reach has grown on a monthly basis over the past couple of years. So the growth from January to June, kind of pre-global football tournament, was higher in 2023 compared to 2022. So that's 16.8 compared to 14.5 million. So a really positive story for sustained growth of women's sport and kind of building on the previous year. Here we're looking at the TV viewing hour breakdown by sport, with the box sizes indicative of the number of viewing hours. So football still dominated in 2023, but cricket grew by 3 percentage points. So in 2023, football made up 74% of total viewing hours, with 70% of this from the Women's World Cup. This was a similar story to 2022, except with the Euros. However, as I mentioned, the key story here is the cricket proportion growing after the success of the Women's Ashes. As shown previously, we've seen a decline in 3-minute unique reach year on year. So on the right, we've just split out the reach by property. So we can see that whilst football remains the most watched property, there has been a year-on-year decline across all football properties, which has resulted in the overall domestic TV decline for 2023 compared to the previous year. Now we just wanted to look at a similar slide to previous, but here excluding football. So cricket was the highest in 2023 and accounted for 58% of total viewing hours, excluding football, with the success of the Ashes and the 100. Netball was also a success story, making up 7% of the viewing hours, driven by the World Cup in South Africa. Increases were also seen for golf across the Women's Open and the Solheim Cup. And on the other hand, with no Rugby World Cups this year, we saw a decline for the rugby properties.
This next section is looking at, I guess, the much discussed 3 p.m. blackout window. So this first slide is just looking at the hour-by-hour trend across the weekend for all channels and how the total average viewership changes across those different times. So I guess the current unique Sunday 6:45 WSL time slot gets relatively lower average viewership, which we'll see on the next slide. And that's likely due to competition of other primetime free-to-air shows, as we see that the biggest peak is around that time on Sunday on this slide. On the other hand, with no Premier League clashes at 3 p.m. on a Saturday and kind of a growing viewership as we get closer to that 6 p.m. point, the Saturday 3 p.m. time slot could help the WSL to capture higher average audiences. And so this slide's looking at kind of the average viewing hours by time slot for the WSL. And in lime green, we've got like free to air. And then in the kind of lighter green, we've got pay TV on Sky. So following on from the last slide, we can see that during the international breaks from the Premier League, when the WSL was shown at 2:30 on a Saturday, its average viewing hours are the highest compared to any other kind of free to air time slot at 1.2 million. Comparatively, on the other side, the Sunday 6:45 p.m. time slot has lower average viewing hours compared to other pay TV time slots, such as 4:30 p.m. on a Sunday. It's obviously important to note that there are other driving factors of viewership, such as the teams that are playing and the competing programming. So this slide looks at the average viewing hours of live WSL broadcasts, and unexpectedly, the average viewing hours on the free-to-air channels on BBC are much higher than the pay TV. But I think that the thing that sticks out to me amongst this slide is that there was growth amongst all channels except Sky Sport Main Event, and this is taken from 45% of the way through the current season. So obviously, there's kind of just over half left to go, and these figures could change. But it's a really good sign initially, particularly from BBC One and Sky Sports Premier League, where we've seen quite big increases year on year. Going back to this idea of competition, as broadcasters continue to try and increase their revenue, they'll continue to leverage the existing supply of sports that they don't currently broadcast to offer more to their subscribers. And this means year on year, we're seeing an increase in the amount of broadcast of men's sports, in particular, those evidenced above. So in the EFL, for example, from the 2024 season, we'll see 1,000 matches shown compared to the current 153. Sticking to football, we'll also see an increase to 270 games per season in the Premier League from the 2025 season. And in the middle here, we've got Rugby League, from which in 2024, every game will be shown live. And this kind of makes the 3 p.m. window, where there's currently no Premier League being shown, a potential important time slot to carve out for women's football coverage.
So you've heard from the Women's Sport Trust analysis on the visibility landscape, but what levers are there for women's sport to drive enhanced visibility in 2024 based on the learnings from last year? As an independent charitable organisation, WST has quite a unique position and viewpoint, but before we talk through our recommendations, we wanted to hear from others. We asked a selection of industry experts to give their view on some of the issues that we think matter most. Firstly, I'm going to hand over to Ben Marlow from the 21st Group. Ben.
Thanks, Tammy. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so 21st Group's view of the world is that the sporting product is what ultimately drives commercial value. So we look at better sport, which drives bigger audiences, which drives greater revenues, which can be reinvested into the sporting product and create something of a virtuous cycle. So that's kind of where we sit in the industry in terms of our philosophy. And we've broken down the sporting product into 3 components. So quality, jeopardy, connection. Quality is fans have a sensitivity to watching the best and elite performers. Jeopardy is the marriage of high stakes and uncertainty. So it's kind of the alchemy of sport that gets people jumping up and down in a stadium. Not much else can deliver that same kind of experience. And then connection is a reason why fans might care, and that could come from multiple different facets. So it could be an authentic fandom through five generations of supporting a particular team, hero athletes, celebrities, betting, storylines, whatever, gaming, anything that gives you a reason to care. So if we apply that framework to women's sports specifically, which is on the next slide, there are a number of challenges that are presented to women's sport today that overcoming would help get more visibility for women's sport through making the product more compelling and more difficult to miss, I guess. So I'm not going to go into all of these in the interest of time, but just with Jeopardy, we know in women's football, for example, the favourite wins 60% of the time relative to 50% for the men. So those games are more predictable and therefore less exciting. Likewise, winning margins in rugby, much bigger in women's rugby than they are in men's rugby. So you get this issue with competitive imbalance in the women's game in certain sports, which over time need to be overcome to create that sort of sense of excitement leading into it. So while there's been huge progress in the women's game, there are a number of these things that we think can be tweaked or improved over time in order to deliver a more compelling product. So things like drafts, more even revenue distribution, etc., could be really effective in that Jeopardy space. Lots more, obviously, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ben. We then asked M&C Saatchi Sport and Entertainment to provide a view on what women's sport can do to drive attention and visibility. Here's Jenny Mitten.
Morning, everyone. So we like to deep dive into the audiences, and I think, as Tammy alluded to earlier, that's really important to unlocking commercial success in women's sport. And we released a report last week, 2 weeks ago now, called Fandom is Dead, Welcome to the Era of Fancom. And I think for us, Fancom is around fan community and really getting under the skin of the behaviours of our audience and then marketing to them and not just copying the men's rule book. I think there's 4 great examples here of how we can tackle women's sport with the Fancom approach. Firstly is hearing the athletes. We know from Women's Sport Trust research, 63% of fans want to see brands showcasing men and women equally and side by side. Brands like O2 have been doing this for years, and we want to see more brands stepping up in this place. Second part, I think it's around being authenticity and coalescing around your audience in an authentic way. We know, so we did some proprietary research, that fans on average have 4.1 passions. So why not bring your brand, your sport, your fan into other passion spaces? I think a really smart example of this, if anyone can remember Nike's Golden Globes campaign, where they put forward the NWSL for the best drama. They had that brilliant billboard, they seeded entertainment stories, and it was really powerful. You're bringing in a huge passion, which is TV, and I know you're all huge TV fans, and women's sport, and creating a really authentic way to showcase the game in a passion space for fans. Secondly is around moving away from, I guess, equality to celebrating empowerment. And we've seen this as a huge commercial play. Think about Beyonce and Taylor Swift and the Barbie movie. When you celebrate female empowerment, not, asking for equality, not, asking to be treated the same way, but celebrate how brilliant the female athletes are, how brilliant the league is, then you can really drive commercial impact. And I think finally, creating new and memorable experiences. And this, again, is digging deep into the fan behaviour. Arsenal are a great example of this. They survey their fans after every game, and O2, the Women's Sport Trust, and the RFU are doing a big piece of work in women's rugby to actually find out who this audience are and what they want. That's what we should all be doing. And let's not copy and paste what the men have done. Let's look at the match day experience, let's look at fan viewing parties, and let's find out what the fans want and turn up in a way that's relevant for them.
Super, thank you, Jenny. We then asked Enders Analysis to look at the current broadcast rights market for women's sport in the light of rising visibility. Jill Hine, what can you tell us?
Thanks, Tammy. Enders Analysis recently published a report on women's football on TV, and within it looked specifically at viewing to the WSL. Now, since moving from BT Sport, average audiences have increased from under 50,000 to 500,000 on the BBC and 200,000 on Sky. We analysed viewing to every live match shown of some different sports last season. Now, on the bottom axis of the chart, we plot the annual rights cost per number of minutes broadcast, and on the left axis, the cost per minutes actually viewed. Now, from this, if you look at the WSL at the bottom left here, it's clear how extremely cost-effective these rights are for broadcasters compared to other sports. So does that mean in the next cycle, the broadcasters should pay, say, 10 or 20 times the amount? Next slide, please. Thanks. Today, the WSL needs the BBC and Sky to maximise its potential audience. The BBC is everywhere, while Sky offers really significant cross-promotion within its extensive Premier League and EFL coverage. And both can reach the future fan through creating high-quality WSL content for their own websites, their branded apps, YouTube, and for other social media. Now, the audience reach there is far greater than the WSL could achieve by itself. Today, the WSL is a cost-effective filler for Sky and helps the BBC's profile. Now, rights values should rise, but in reality, the WSL needs strong broadcasters more than they need the WSL.
Thanks, Jill. In view of the growing visibility of women's sport, we then asked Two Circles to look at the sponsorship landscape. Emma Cordell, over to you.
Thanks, Tammy. Hi, everyone. Women's sport allows brands to access an incremental audience they've never been able to tap into within sport before. One that's more female, it's younger, it's more values-driven, and has a higher brand sentiment. This has led to an understanding that IP and association-related sponsorship assets have a higher impact in women's sports than men's sports. But there's been challenges in proving this before. Now, with increasingly sophisticated valuation methods and more insights on this audience, we will see previously trapped value being unlocked, driving women's sports valuations even higher. And if we want to click on to the next slide, I'll just touch on a couple of our key trends across women's sports partner content. So badged assets like the NWSL Ali Rookie of the Month drive reach, engagement, and media value, whereas branded content like EA Sports Behind the Baller is more effective at enhancing brand understanding and message awareness. Both have a place in your partner content mix, but having a clear understanding of your partner's ambitions is crucial when developing out activation ideas. And I'll just quickly touch on TikTok. So TikTok is a great platform for women's sport as it offers a large overlap in audiences. It's seeing female athletes and influencers driving high engagements, and it's currently underutilized when it comes to sponsorship. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a balance to be struck, but we see there being a big opportunity with this platform for women's sports partner content in 2024.
Thanks, Emma, and a huge thanks to Jenny, Ben, Jill, and Emma. Absolutely brilliant to have your involvement, and a reminder to all of you listening that this is all downloadable from the Women's Sport Trust website. So you can ponder over this for time to come. Moving on then. Back to us. Reflecting, so on the next slide, reflecting on everything we've heard, we wanted to conclude with some thoughts from WST on some areas of focus we see for women's sport going forward. There is so much to do, but we've chosen 5. Each area has data within the report to support it, or at least to spark your thinking around it. And I think it's really important to highlight that none of this is easy. We can't underestimate the energy that it takes to get any one of these right. But it's good to have goals, hey? So firstly, continue to grow audiences. There's still lots to understand around the barriers to gender parity. We're also reminded about the importance of free-to-air coverage at this stage of development. As a public broadcaster, we anticipate that the BBC will continue to set new standards in this area. We need to focus on new audiences and continue to convert fans of men's sport and become much more sophisticated around how we market to different groups, as brought to focus when we compared TV audiences to ticket purchasers. And growing reach calls for greater insight into the behaviours that drive attention and habit. Secondly, there's a need to expand out to culture and community. We've all talked about the need for a year-round narrative, and that what we need to ensure that the growth isn't exclusively football focused. Women's sport doesn't have generational legacy, so we also need to understand its appeal to younger audiences, which we've shown are keen to engage. This report additionally points to innovation in delivery, a chance for new rights models to be established, a need to create that appointment to view. And we've highlighted social as a huge area that not only the UK is leading the way on, but also demonstrates a potential for leagues and clubs. You know, we speak about women's sport being distinct, but then we generally revert to old metrics to define value. It's really time to modernise our value methodology across the industry, moving in the first instance from quantity to quality. And lastly, we've seen record-breaking attendance, the best-in-class social reach across digital. We need to celebrate and own our status as world leader in the growth of women's sport. Now, there's a lot to take in this report. We don't tend to hold back on what we offer you. I really recommend that you spend some time with it. It's available to download on our website, as said before. For those who don't know, we're a charity. I know, and for over a decade, we've been doing things like this report to help move the industry forward and enable it to demonstrate that it values women and girls. We are gratefully in receipt of public funds from Sport England, and as such, we need to show that what we do has an impact. If we can't do that, we stop being able to help you. And we want to understand what you find most helpful. So really, we'd benefit so much from you completing a survey just to give us your thoughts, tell us if it's useful or not. And nothing of this will be shared public without your permission. It's really about, for our understanding, and then also for us to prove to public funders that we are actually doing something worthwhile. So we'd be grateful if you complete that. That's the end of the presentation. And whilst this has been going on, I know that Laura Weston has been eagerly reading all of your comments and things. Laura, once I find you on the, oh, there we are, I shall pin you to the, so everybody can see your wonderful, oh, there you are. I want to try and pin Shalina as well if I can find her. Laura, what are you picking up?
Some really good questions, so thank you, everybody. I know there was a lot to take in, as Tammy said, but everyone's really got to grips with it quite quickly. This is a really interesting question. With there not being an international tournament for the Lionesses until 2025, I mean, we've had the World Cup and the Euros back to back. We've been really lucky. Is there a risk figures could slip this year with men's Euros taking over the summer and the Olympics?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, I think it's a pretty fair question, and I think it is, I guess, something of concern, if maybe not to use too harsh of a word. I think, yeah, on the surface, I think overall figures could slip slightly, just because we've seen that those big global tournaments do just bring in such a big reach because of the nature of them and the fact they've got constant free-to-air coverage. I think on the flip side, it does give an opportunity for some of those domestic sports to really increase. I think, I guess particularly on pay TV, we've shown that kind of there's a variety of sports that are becoming more popular, and lots of things like the Open Solheim Cup, cricket are all kind of increasing. So I think there is an opportunity to kind of capitalize on that break in women's sport coverage in a clever way. I think obviously the men's Euros being on is going to capitalize a lot of attention. So it's probably, I guess, kind of similar to what we're talking about with the Barclays WSL and kind of capitalizing on potentially that 3 p.m. moment. It's sort of picking those moments cleverly to, you know, carve out the time and space for women's sport in the absence of any big global tournament while competing with men's sports. So yeah, not an easy one, but I do think that on the surface it might seem negative, but hopefully there could be some positive stories that come out of it, particularly from kind of maybe on the non-linear TV side of some of the digital stuff that Tammy went through. Potentially there's opportunities there to grow that, and potentially even the opportunity to cross promote as well throughout that time.
Yeah, I'm a glass half full person, and I think, God, what an opportunity there is. We have been so reliant on these international moments. And now we have a point when it's not happening and other things are there isn't a big international football moment for example, and it's like, God, let's see what we can do, people. You know, there is so much in this report to point to the potential that we've got, particularly around digital and social platforms. So I feel let's see what we can do.
Well, let's not underestimate the power of the Olympics for women's sport as well, because for many of us, it was the only thing we had growing up to watch women's sport. And obviously it's how you founded the WST, Tammy.
Absolutely, yeah. Without London 2012, we wouldn't exist.
We wouldn't be here, so we've got to be good. Someone said, this is fascinating, thank you, Sarah. As an avid women's sport viewer myself, and others often comment on the additional effort it takes to watch women's sport, often having to go hunting to find when and where to watch matches. Do you think that improving the visibility and simplicity of how to watch women's sport would boost some of these figures?
I think we all agree that discoverability is something that needs to be worked on, cross promoting and etc. etc. It's, you know, in all the discussions that you have sort of with broadcasters and etc. We're all everybody's aware of it, but I don't think it's totally cracked it yet, which is a bit of a fluffy answer, but yeah.
I think discoverability is absolutely key, isn't it? Having an appointment to view always helps everybody. So we need that in women's sport. It's just very complicated landscape in trying to find those moments which are free for women's sports. It's been tough. Are you considering conducting research into how avid women's sport fans watch and engage with a sporting event versus avid men's sports fans, aka fandom behaviour? We have already done some of this, have we not?
We have, yeah. So last summer, a partnership with the RNA, and we brought Gemba in as our research company person, whatever, people, wonderful people, we actually looked into that. We deep dived into the committed fan. and pointed to the fact that they were underserved in content, and we were able to showcase the types of things that they were interested in. It's going to see how that, interesting to watch how that evolves. When we focused in on those TikTok videos, you could see how it was mirroring what we predicted what we pointed to in that RNA research is actually coming out in those WSL top hits. But we're in a constantly evolving industry and marketplace. So the other thing I'm struck by is what was certain sort of a couple of years ago in an evolving marketplace changes. So we've got to consistently been going back and asking these questions.
So true. So with the increasing adoption of pay TV and direct-to-consumer models, do you anticipate more women's sports opting for their own platforms to reach audiences directly?
Oh, Shalina, I'll let you take that one. I'll throw it back to Laura.
Yeah. I think my gut feeling is not yet. I think there is a time for that, and I think that could be really successful. But I think some of what we've shown and I guess discussed is that women's sport is still growing and there's still a lot of work to do. And I think pushing it entirely away from not only linear TV, but I guess especially free to air, I think could potentially be more harmful at this stage than it would be positive. I guess my take on it would be that there are other ways to kind of directly reach women's sport consumers that wouldn't be around just moving everything off of linear TV or free to air. I think, like as Tammy mentioned, there was a slide kind of on different ways to engage, so like the fan groups and WhatsApp channels and things like that I think are maybe going to become more important in terms of reaching women's sports fans and especially younger fans. I think the pay TV side of it and moving away from that even to a level, moving people to pay TV has kind of been a journey that we're sort of now seeing the benefits of, and I think moving it entirely away from that in this moment would maybe be a bit more harmful. I think there are ways we can sort of do that to an extent, and when women's sport is in that we would then maybe see that move away to direct to consumer or rights holders' own platforms.
Yeah.
Before we just go, just a shout out to Shalina and the guys at Futures. You absolutely fantastic what you provide, and I'm also aware, Shalina, you're in America at the moment. You're probably the bottom half of you is in your pajamas. Grateful for you waking up in the wee hours of the morning for the women's sport cause.
No, I've positioned my camera so you can't see the windows on purpose.
So a question about kind of more viral elements, I suppose. So are there any new themes coming out? Any trends of specific things that are working for women's sport? Any big viral moments we've seen in women's sport versus men's that brands have done?
Laura, that's one for you.
I know. I would say no. we haven't seen enough. Certainly, there's. I think we always get a bit excited around international tournaments that we're going to see those big brand moments, that big exciting innovation around brand sponsorship in women's sport, and I think we haven't quite seen that yet. I think probably the orange ad, the French ad last year, was the one that got most talkability and got passed around the most and caused quite a binary opinion on whether people liked it or not. So that was interesting. But I think I
love the WNBA and the Deloitte ones.
We did like that one. Yeah.
I really love those ones.
Yeah. There's some interesting work coming out. I think Chris and I have been looking at this a little bit more, and that's why we pulled out those TikTok videos from the WSL to look at what people are really engaging with. And actually, it's just some of it's just kind of getting that hygiene factor of understanding that we do need to show skills. We do need to show, goals. We need to show those things. Women still don't want everything to be wrapped in entertainment. They still want to see the sport and they want to see the skill. And, and a lot of us who play sport also, want to know how to get better. So there's a bit of that. Of course, people are connecting still with the players and the personalities, and we need to understand how to bring that out, I think, a little bit more. But I think what we'll see over the next year, because we haven't got that international tournament, is hopefully a lot more innovation. And I think, with NewCo coming in with the WSL, I think there will be a big push on content, and we'll see some really interesting stuff. And I've no doubt the WSL will start to lead the world in kind of creative content in the next coming season. So that's my penny for my thoughts. You didn't really ask, but there you go.
Thanks, Laura.
Also, just to add to that, I think there's been a lot of kind of more like move towards purpose-driven sponsorships, and I think there is a real opportunity for women's sport to partner with brands that just wouldn't necessarily make sense or work for men's sport in a way, which I think we're starting to see of it. I guess one that kind of jumps to mind is the big Clinique one around skincare and women's rugby, and I think like that's a really big one that I don't think would exist in men's sport in the same capacity, or at least hadn't previously. Maybe it will moving forward, but I think, yeah, I guess outside of that, I think there's different ways, I guess, to activate it. And I think maybe we'll see more of that in women's sport going forward as well, which would set it apart from men's sport, or what men's sport has done previously, at least.
It's an interesting one, that whole sort of purpose thing, because I think sometimes people confuse purpose with sort of that charitable good sort of, that kind of stuff. And I'd like us, for me, it's helpful to think of purposeful rather than purpose. Purpose sort of chops me into that sort of almost that old way, that CSR sort of thing. And we want to be, commercially driven, but with values, and actually speaking to the audience and speaking to, to recognizing, demonstrating value of women and girls. Laura, you look like I just cut you off speaking. Were you just about to say something? Oh, okay.
No. I think I was going to say, I'm hoping that we'll start to see brands that haven't activated in sport before, more brands coming into women's sport, and particularly startups. I think there's some really interesting Angel City have done a really good job of attracting kind of new brands, and I think they automatically don't fall into the sort of tropes that sort of existing brands do around sports marketing. So I think if we can attract those brands, they will just bring that fresh approach and look at it in a different way, and they'll see the benefit of women's sport and all that kind of it brings. So
yeah, the other thing that I think the types of brands will change as women's sport develops as well, and each sort of league and club and whatever is at a different stage and therefore needs different things. So what is purposeful, the brand category, is going to be different. So it's coming away from these normal metrics, or these are the categories, or this is the thing that we count the numbers on, and trying to really get underneath to see what's actually going to move the dial.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of questions kind of asking for more, which is brilliant. Regional breakdowns, more information about other sports, and just to reiterate Tammy's point, really, we are a charity, and obviously we try and cover as much as we possibly can, but we have to have some parameters in place, unfortunately, or else we would happily talk about this all day and got all the data we possibly could, but we can't do that. So we want to hear about lots of comparison of sports versus men. But thinking about audiences that see women's sport as an entertainment experience, either as communities or families, how can we ensure that women's sport gain a greater share of time for experiences? So this is something that we kind of talk about a lot in terms of, maybe we're looking at women's sport, if you're looking at it as a family day out. So it could be, we can go to the cinema, we can go to the zoo, or we'll go to a women's sport game. I suppose that those kind of decisions and conversations are starting to happen in the households.
Yeah, it's because it hasn't got that generational sort of legacy to it. It is a new form of entertainment that is coming on board. So I don't have a problem with it being entertainment. I don't totally understand the question. So instead of just rambling a load of rubbish, I'll just admit to it.
It's always good to be honest. I think it's just it's insight, isn't it, into how, understanding the audience and what they're connecting with. So when we think about when we've seen that the attendance data from 2 Circles and stuff that everybody's provided us with, which has been amazing, what we're seeing is that younger female audience really connecting with live sport. And that for me is fascinating. And so the next part of that, now we've identified that audience, is to understand what are they connecting with? What is it that they want to get from women's sport, they do get from women's sport that makes it so so right for them. You know, I was at Liverpool Arsenal WSL game the other week, and it makes me so happy to see these groups of 20-somethings all together and really enjoying it. And you kind of, I think for a long time people said Gen Z are not going to be interested in live sport. It's too long for them. They only want, you know, to watch it in very small clips. But certainly that live experience is definitely appealing to them. And I think the same is for families. Like, what are the things that we need to pull out to understand, you know, what's going to connect with them around live sport? And often it'll be fans of men's sport as well, but they'll be in a different mindset when they're at a women's game than they might be at a men's game. So we need to understand that. There's loads of nuance in that we need to get through. But
you've talked about that yourself, Laura, as a Liverpool fan, and talked about your behaviour.
My allegiances.
The men's game and the women's game is totally different. So that need to look beyond that usual demographic to sort of really delve. And there was a question I think we had at the start around behaviours. I think that's a really important area that we need to delve into more, is the types of behaviours and also how to sort of move people along. I'm aware that the time is ticking on,
yes,
so there's probably one final question, whether you want to pull it or make it up yourself.
Oh, okay. Oh no, under pressure. Right, hold on. It's quite hard. There's lots of thank yous, which is very kind. So Shalina, just is there any research on the overlap between people who watch women's sport and other entertainment shows, e.g. are women's sport fans more likely to watch Bake Off?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually something we've not really looked into, but something we can take away for the next webinar to have a look. But yeah, it'd be an interesting, I guess, follow up on the point around women's sport being an entertainment property, and I guess whether people view it that way. I think one of the bits that I guess was most surprising to us when we first started doing this research a few years ago is that, like, the women's sport viewer is actually not, you know, entirely female, or it's a bit more similar to kind of an overall sports viewer. And so I think that was kind of, I guess, our first surprising takeaway. And so it'd be interesting to see, I guess, those entertainment shows kind of skew more female just because of the free-to-air coverage. And so it'd be interesting to see how that does compare and whether there's kind of a more unique group of people that are watching those entertainment shows that might then be interested in women's sport. But yes, takeaways that we could do that and haven't yet. So stay tuned for the next webinar.
So I'm going to leave you with this comment because it makes me really happy, from Jane. Thank you. I feel more positive, inspired about the current status and future of coverage and engagement of women's sport. That's why we're here.
What a brilliant thing to end on. And I just want to say as well, a massive thank you to everyone who took part today, our sort of expert panels, to Futures, to Laura, to Chris behind the scenes, and also to, you know, a lot of what we put out was organizations, clubs, leagues, whatever, actually sharing their data with us to enable us to sort of analyze it and give you the report today. So incredibly grateful to them as well. We want to keep pushing this out, keep pushing the industry forward. So please do fill our survey in. If you download report, it's that page is clickable. I figured out how to do that. So please give us your thoughts. Please encourage your colleagues to head to the Women's Sport Trust website to download their copy. And thank you all again for joining us and for everybody for their contributions.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you very much.
Good. Perfect.
Thank you.